Well, thank you very much, Daniel Otuosante, for that insightful explainer on our Spotlight segment. And then now we move straight into the Expert Speaks segment of our show. If you're now joining us, you're still watching Africa Speaks right here on Pan-African Television. So today we happen to be discussing about the 5th Pan-African Congress that happened in Manchester in 1945. To help us put flesh to this issue and understand the context better, we are joined by Comrade Kwesi Pratt Jr., the General Secretary of the Socialist Movement of Ghana and one of the leading voices in Pan-Africanism, to help us understand how the Congress, as at that time, seemed to reflect on our struggles, our ongoing struggles that happen within the context we find ourselves in today. You're welcome, Comrade Kwesi Pratt Jr. on Africa Speaks.
Thank you.
So today we are discussing, or we are looking at 80 years down the line, the 5th Pan-African Congress that happened in Manchester. Could you tell us a bit about the historical context in which the 5th Pan-African Congress was organized around that area, and why, as at that time, African leaders around the world and around the diaspora came together in that moment?
Well, 1945 was a very important year. It was a year in which the struggles of the African people on the continent and the diaspora had intensified. First, to fight against the discrimination against them on the basis of the color of our skin. Racism was very high in the world at the time. It's also important to understand that most of the countries in Africa then, a large number of countries in Africa then, were under the colonial yoke. And it's important also to understand the context of the end of the Second World War, in which Africans had fought in a war that they did not have to participate in which Africans had been used as cannon fodder virtually for European powers who were struggling against or fighting against the Hitlerite army, the fascist Hitlerite army in Germany. Now, it is significant that the Congress brought together many people from the diaspora and also a lot of people from the African continent. It's important to recognize that this Congress was the 5th in the series that had been organized. And it had come after the Back to Africa movement, had not made much headway. It had come at a time when there was general frustration about how to kick off the colonial yoke, how to build a prosperous, independent, and sovereign Africa. This is the context within which the 5th Pan-African Congress took place.
All right, thank you very much, Comrade. So could you tell us some of the discussions that happened, or some resolutions that happened within that Congress as at that time, and how those resolutions were able to champion the self-determination that most African countries were seeking at that time?
Again, it is significant to know that many of the leaders who led Africa to independence were at this conference. Kwame Nkrumah was there. Jomo Kenyatta was the joint secretary at this meeting. Nnamdi Azikiwe was there. Many of the leaders who led Africa to independence were present in this historic meeting. And therefore, there was a certain focus on national liberation on the continent. National liberation was a very key agenda on this conference. It is significant also to note that trade unions also participated actively in this Congress. And the trade unions were concerned largely about respect for trade union rights, about the participation of the working people in their own emancipation and so on. So trade unionism also featured quite prominently on the agenda in this conference. And then, of course, there were the youth movements, there were the women's movement. Broadly, this Congress brought together the whole wide spectrum of activists for freedom in Africa and on the continent.
Good. So you mentioning or situating the Congress in the global spectrum, as you were saying it. So can you tell us some some of the major issues or some of the move that this Congress channeled that sought to position the struggle against anti-imperialism and colonialism in the broader global context and not just limited to Africa?
Well, one of the things that the Congress decided was that Africans everywhere on the continent, in the diaspora, everywhere, had a historic responsibility to participate in the national liberation struggle. And the national liberation struggle was basically about asserting the independence of the colonized people on the continent. It was also about creating the conditions for the peoples of Africa, one, to own their resources, and two, to exploit these resources for their own benefit. The other dimension of the discussions had to do with the unity of the African people. You know, the need to unite all the African people after the national liberation struggle. And then there was a segment of the discussions which dwelled on the efficacy of socialism as an ideology for liberation, an ideology for national reconstruction. So all the resolutions passed at this Congress emphasized national liberation, emphasized the unity of the working people, emphasized the control of our resources, both in terms of ownership and who benefited from the exploitation of these resources, and ultimately the building of the United States of Africa under the broad banner of scientific socialism.
Right. So 80 years down the line, we all know when we look around, we can see that the actualization of some of these resolutions that came up during the Manchester Congress has not been realized. We know that it hasn't come to play. Can you tell us some of the factors that has led to this?
Well, the struggle did not begin and end in 1945. The struggle continues, and even today, the struggle gets intensified. The forces against us, the forces of imperialism, multinational corporations, you know, the intelligence services of Western countries and so on, continue to work against our aspiration. So there have been reversals, there have been advances, and so on. And it's significant that the intensification of this struggle has led to some really horrible developments in our history. For example, Patrice Lumumba, who was democratically elected as Prime Minister of the Congo, had his government overthrown. And then subsequently he was arrested, he was tortured, and he was executed. And his body was dissolved in acid. I mean, that's a long story. And that caused a substantial reversal in the Congo, the consequences of which we see today in the never-ending wars that have been unleashed in the Congo. He was killed along with people like Patrice Mulele and co. were killed as part of the struggle, as part of the effort to reverse, you know, the gains that the National Liberation Movement were making, to reverse the broad Pan-Africanist gains that came after 1945 and so on. In Ghana, for example, the government of Osagyefo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah was also overthrown in a coup in 1966 with very, very serious consequences for the struggles in Ghana. Indeed, after the overthrow of the Nkrumah government, it became an offense, you know, a punishable offense, an offense which could land you in prison if you were just seen with a photograph of Nkrumah or if you distributed photographs of Nkrumah. Books on socialism and Pan-Africanism were banned, were burnt in bonfires, and so on. And this has been replicated throughout Africa. You know, more recently, for example, the killing of Chris Hani of South Africa is a manifestation of that struggle. You know, so the struggle is continuing. There have been reverses, and these reverses have occasioned, as a result of the intensification of the efforts of imperialism, the Western countries, the multinational corporations, and so on, to reverse the gains that we have made. The result of all of this is that we have now been plunged into a neo-colonial era in which we have the semblance of independence, but in fact, you know, we are still colonized. And we have been colonized in many ways. For example, if you take French-speaking African countries, they are compelled to keep their foreign reserves in the central bank of France. And as a result, they borrow their own money and pay interest on their own money that they have borrowed. It is also manifested in the establishment of many military bases across the African continent. French military bases, US military bases, NATO military bases, and so on. All of this are signs of the reversals that we have suffered and continue to suffer, from the gains that we made from 1945.
Right. And in all these issues that you've outlined, in all these problems that you've outlined that continue to face us as Africans, what do you think are the urgent steps that we need to make sure that we realize the dreams of the Manchester Conference? And most especially positioning it in today's struggle, what should Pan-African movement do in relation to the emergence of the AES, what is happening in Palestine, and linking it to what is happening in Western Sahara? What is the path forward for us?
Well, we have no option to mobilization. Mobilization, and mobilization is the answer to the problems that confront us. Our people need to be mobilized. Our people need to be organized into formidable forces that will be able to withstand the aggression, of the West. As we speak, there are efforts to topple the governments in the alliance of Sahel states, mainly Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali. And NATO is very, very active in subverting these governments. It's our responsibility as Pan-Africanists, it's our responsibility as socialists and so on, to mobilize in solidarity with these governments, to help them overcome the problems that their people face, and to point to the fact that these governments, these patriotic governments of patriotic revolutions that are breaking out in Africa, have our support, have our intelligence, and have our mobilizing capacity. It's important in this effort to emphasize, the point that we need to adopt an internationalist approach to the struggle. We are not sufficiently capable of resolving these problems in our so-called nation states. And we need to go outside and mobilize forces that think like us and act together in order to bring about the resolution of these problems. We cannot forget the fact that the Western countries act together. Their intelligence services work together. Their financial resources and so on are put together in the struggle against us, in the struggle to keep us perpetually poor, dependent, and so on. And their unity dictates that we also unite in this bold confrontation with underdevelopment, with poverty, with misery, and with domination.
Well, thank you very much. But finally, I think it has come to a notice that coming next month, there would be, should I put it, a celebration or commemorating the 80th anniversary of the 5th Pan-African Congress in Accra. Could you tell us about it and then the message you are looking forward to put across?
Well, a number of organizations, initially Ghanaian organizations, came together to form the Pan-African People's Progressive Front to begin to prepare for the observance of the 80th anniversary of the 1945 Manchester Congress. Now, the most important thing was to take stock of where we are today and also to define what we need to do in order to break out of the chains of neocolonialism, and also to seek reparative justice for the injustices which have been done to us. Preparations for the conference, the commemoration, are well advanced now. And as of yesterday, people from about 40 to 50 countries in Africa have applied, to be in this conference. It's also important to announce that the President of Ghana, John Dramani Mahama, who is also the African Union Special Representative, the African Union Champion for Reparations, has agreed to actually host the event and also to open the event. There are efforts being made today to bring aboard a few other African heads of states, like Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso, like His Excellency Mnangagwa of Zimbabwe and others, to fully participate in this conference. which is scheduled for the 18th and 19th of November. So preparations are underway, work is being done, and things look very, very bright. Indeed, the organizers are also expecting to have a recorded message from President Diaz-Canel of Cuba, and also from leaders in Venezuela, and around the world, to encourage the participants to keep on the path of liberation and justice.
Thank you very much, Comrade Kwesi Pratt, for joining us on this segment of Africa Speaks. If you're watching us, this has been a conversation around the 5th Pan-African Conference in Manchester that seeks to look at the struggles that the African people face and positioning it in the global struggle for anti-imperialism and neo-colonialism that we continue to face in our world today.